Good evening. I want to thank the board for the opportunity to present this evening, and I also want to thank our business office staff for their assistance in developing tonight's presentation, specifically Tanya Mulrad, Michael Buffamonte, Patricia Wallace, and Mr. Patrick Cahill. In tonight's budget presentation, we'll take a look at staffing from the following perspectives. We'll begin by looking at district-wide FTEs, or full-time equivalent positions, that we are proposing for the 2023-2024 school year. These positions will be reviewed in two separate categories, those included in the general fund and those that will be funded through federal grants. We will then provide an overview of expenditures or salaries for district personnel. And finally, we'll examine the costs associated with employee benefits. We're going to begin by taking a look at district-wide FTEs, or full-time equivalent positions, that we're proposing for the 2023-24 school year. On the first slide, we break down our district personnel into 18 categories, or departments, and provide a year-to-year comparison of FTEs. You'll see that we have a proposed total of 1,124.82 FTEs for next year, which represents an overall year-to-year decrease of 4.86%. For most of these categories, you'll see that the numbers are essentially flat from one year to the next. Simply put, we have not added any new FTEs to next year's budget. The few areas that show increases are due to recoding from other departments as opposed to adding new FTEs. For example, you'll see an increased FTE in buildings and grounds because our two district couriers and a part-time mechanic were moved from their previous budget code in transportation to a more appropriate budget code in buildings and grounds. Thus, the reduction in transportation as well. The remainder of the FTE decrease in transportation constitutes 3 bus attendants, 2 bus drivers, and 1 mechanic position that were budgeted for but went unfilled this year. The other small increases reflect necessary changes that were made after our initial budget proposal for this school year. For example, there's an increase in health services because 2 RNs were added over the summer to address needs of incoming students. Do we have any questions so far? Sweet. All the positions or FTEs that we just talked about are part of our proposed general fund budget. It's important to understand that there are an additional 38.12 positions that are alternately funded through federal grants. The title grants and IDEA grants are recurring grants, and they provide the district with money each year. You can see how important this funding is for our instructional staff, as it provides us with salaries for 25 teachers and teaching assistants. The last 2 lines on this slide represent FTEs funded through ARPA, or the American Rescue Plan Act. It's important to note that this funding is not recurring and is set to expire in September of 2024. Now that we know how many employees or FTEs we have district-wide, let's take a look at how they're allocated. The graphics on this slide share the following information. First, it shows us how our human resources are allocated throughout the district. And second, it shows us what percentage of each subgroup represents what percentage each subgroup represents in our overall personnel budget. And as you would expect, the largest portion of our workforce is our instructional staff, representing 82.5% of our overall staff expenditures. We'll now look a little further into each of these subgroups and explore the year-to-year salary comparison. I want to start by focusing on the last line of this chart. You can see a proposed budget of $104,986,057. This represents an overall proposed increase of 2.46% for staff salaries. In each of these subgroups, you'll see a modest percentage increase that is reflective of employee step increases and contractual increases. For example, our CSEA employees are due for 2% raises next year in addition to their step increases. You'll notice a decrease in transportation, and that is tied into the increase for buildings and grounds and the 3 positions that were recoded from the one department to another. The reductions in transportation FTEs, as mentioned earlier, are also a contributing factor to the transportation decrease. Again, it's important to mention that those positions, although previously budgeted, were unfilled this year. Now I want to look at safety and security. You'll see that we have an increase in that line as well. You saw earlier that we had a reduction of 2 FTEs for safety and security. So you may be asking the question, why are we going down in positions but up in expenditures? And that's a good question. As Patrick mentioned in his presentation at our last board meeting, this number represents a reallocation away from hiring full-time safety officers and towards hiring more part-time subs, and I want to explain that. Safety officers are civil service employees. We have exhausted the list, or the eligible list of the list of eligible candidates. We've been through everyone on the list. It's been difficult to fill those full-time positions, but we understand that there's still a need in our buildings. So we have been able to hire additional part-time employees who have more flexible schedules. The largest percentage increase on this slide is in the other category. At 23.65%, the percentage increase is large, but the dollar amount is small. And it represents only 0.87% of our staffing expenditures. This category includes health insurance buyouts and vacation buyouts, and we need to adequately appropriate funds in this area. Do you have any questions at this point? When we think of staffing costs, we typically focus on salaries, but it's very important that we don't forget the component of employee benefits. Employee benefits, or fringe benefits, as they're often referred to, can be broken down into the following 6 categories. Health insurance coverage for active employees, as well as retirees, and that accounts for 55% of budget benefit expenditures, as you can see by this chart. Contributions to ERS and TRS retirement systems account for roughly another 23% of costs. 15% of the benefits budget is allocated for FICA tax, which is a payroll tax that's paid to the federal government. Employer insurance is a small percentage at 3%, and that includes workers' comp, life insurance, and unemployment insurance. Dental and vision is pretty self-explanatory. And the last and smallest portion is other employee benefits, and that includes retiree incentives and tuition reimbursement. We're now going to look a little further into each of these categories and their year-to-year comparison. In this chart, we've outlined the expenditures for each benefit category, and the overall increase is 4.97%. is largely driven by 2 things: increases in health insurance premiums and an increase in contributions to New York State retirement systems. As you can see, the health insurance is our largest benefit expenditure, and the cost increase of approximately 4.5% is due to an increase in premiums through the Orange Ulster Health Care Plan, which Patrick mentioned at our last board meeting. If you look at the line for retirement systems, you see an increase of 10%. The increase in this area, unfortunately, is out of district control. The rates of contribution are dictated by New York State ERS and TRS retirement systems. And for informational purposes, the ERS includes our non-instructional employees, such as clerical, food service, bus drivers, and safety. we anticipate a 13 to 15% increase in the employer contribution rate for the next year for these employees. The good news is that the rate for TRS for our certified employees remained relatively flat.
Lori, I have a question on the retirement systems,
Okay.
if you don't mind. What drives the 10.02%? I know it comes from the state, but the markets are up, investment rates are up, so how is that calculated?
Patrick?
Well, it's, allow me to jump in. It's really based on two factors. So it's the employer contribution rate, which Lori just discussed, and we're seeing an increase with the ERS rate, right? So it's 13 to 15% approximately. And it's also the payroll. So the change in the payroll also drives that. So we're anticipating, as everything does, payrolls go up, inflation has been going up. So it's driving that ahead. We also have employees that receive not just a contractual increase, but a step in many cases. So it's, as Lori mentioned, 2%, but it's in some cases more than 2%. So it's really those two factors that drive that higher. And it is one of those things that's entirely out of our control. And to get to your question about the employer contribution rates, for the retirement systems, I know the ERS, they have almost, it's like a smoothing effect where they take a 5-year rolling average and they look at, mortality and demographics and market, financial markets, how that's changing. So it often there can be a problem, right, in the financial markets, which isn't fully manifest yet in the employer contribution rate. And that's almost like the level. They depending on what's happening, right, if markets are down, that rate is going to go up. And that's why we have a TRS reserve for the teacher retirement system, which is the larger piece of it, and we have an ERS reserve. That acts as that level for us locally. So when the rates are high, we can use our reserves to sort of stabilize that and level that out, that fluctuation or variation.
That's exactly how I would have answered this one.
Thank you very much.
So can I just, the contribution rate depends on, can you explain the market?
Well, the retirement systems make investments, right? So they have, in many cases, an employee contribution. So there are employees, newer employees are like, say, a Tier 6 employee, so they have to make a contribution. So out of their paycheck, they make a contribution. I don't even know, Tier 6 at this, maybe 6%. There are other employees, it may be a Tier 4, that's the majority, which after 10 years, they no longer have to make a contribution. So those monies go to the retirement system. And then there's the employer contribution rate. So for every dollar that's earned for an ERS employee, next year we're going to send 15 cents to the ERS retirement system. They invest those monies, right? So it's like any pension fund. They have a massive amount of money which is invested by the New York State Controller. I think he's the fiduciary that's responsible for that. They obviously use financial consultants and other things, but they invest that. So it is impacted by the performance of the financial markets, right? And they have, I presume, a diversified portfolio. They invest in a lot of different kinds of assets. So when the market is not doing well over the course of time, and I mentioned they have this 5-year rolling average, which is like a statistical smoothing mechanism, eventually, if it stays down for a long enough period of time, the value of that retirement system is going to decrease. And the rate, because the mortality is the same and the number of people retiring, all that has not really changed substantially. But the employer contribution rate needs to go up because they need to have a certain value to meet their future obligations. And that can vary. There was a time, if you look back during the internet bubble period, the employer contribution rates were incredibly low because the market was, stratospheric, high. So, it's a function of that to some degree.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
I want to go over our key takeaways from the presentation. Takeaways are, We are committed to providing quality education for all students while keeping our taxpayers in mind and being fiscally responsible. Without the addition of any new FTEs, we are able to retain all current programs for the next 2023-24 school year and ensure that our students get the best education, the education that we've all come to expect at Monroe Woodbury. Thank you. Are there any more questions about the entire presentation?
I have a few, sorry. So the part-time security employees, I assume they get the same training
They do.
as the full-time, so we're not really losing anything there.
Yeah, the issue with the safety really was a matter of, it's a civil service position. We hire off a civil service list, and when the list no longer exists because we've hired everyone we can off of it, we then explore the option of hiring part-time staff. The training is similar, the expectations are identical. It's just a way for us to get the bodies we need, even though they don't exist on a list, and at the same time, make sure our buildings are staffed. But it also allows us in a positive, there is a positive to it in that people have more of a flexible schedule.
Great, thank you. And then one other question. So I think last meeting, we were told that we expect an increase in students next year. Is that accurate?
Increase in, say it again?
Students next year?
No.
No?
That's-
Decrease?
No, I think that was in reference to transportation.
Okay.
So when the transportation was talking about their contract transportation to students who go to schools that are outside of Monroe Woodbury, I'm not talking about students that we send to other programs, but students who do not attend our schools, that was where the increase was referenced.
Okay,
Was not students necessarily that are attending Monroe Woodbury.
great, thank you for the clarification. My main concern was just class size. If we're staying the same amount of teachers, obviously we already overburdened
Our student enrollment is not going up, and that is actually something we are keeping a very close eye on.
So class size should
K through
stay the
12.
same or reduce.
That's true.
Right.
Great.
And we saw some of that last year in our K-1 buildings. We saw smaller class sizes, about 19 or 20 students. And so one of the things that we've done, I think Ms. Hock talked about, that we are not hiring more people, but as enrollment is going down, because that is part of what's going on in the district, enrollment is going down, we're keeping to a class size. And so part of what we discussed as a cabinet is, what's the optimal class size? And we came up with sort of a chart to make sure that we keep class sizes to something that's manageable, right? So elementary schools, I think we go up to 21 or 20 students in a class,
Depending on the grade level.
depending on the grade level, and then there's 22, 23, and, we did that K-5. And then when you get into the middle school and high school, it's a little different because it really depends on the course, and so that gets a little bit more complicated. But that's something that we, as a cabinet, discussed and felt it was really important not to, as enrollment went down, not to have any employees leave, but rather take the employees and use them in other ways.
And we are, on a weekly basis, monitoring those numbers.
And just as an example, I know I keep talking, I apologize, but just as an example, we've gone down rather a significant number of students at Central Valley. And so what we do is we look at the teachers and we move them to other buildings so that they can make sure that we have good numbers across the board.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Is that the trend for the next school year, that will be down? Is there like a percentage that you can put on that at this point? or
Well,
is
we
it
don't
still
talk
fluctuating?
percentage, we actually talk sections.
Okay,
So we look at schools in number of sections, so I believe Central Valley's going down 3 sections.
is that the same grade, or is it across grade levels?
That would be across 3 grades.
Okay, so it's not all one grade that's
I
losing three
think-
sections?
Right.
Okay,
Right, because it depends on the total number of students that would be enrolled in the whole school, and then depending on, where they fall. That's how that works.
so that's the only school that's losing
No,
sections?
Pine Tree is also losing, I believe, 2 sections.
Okay,
So 2 sections is 2 teachers, right?
Right.
2 classrooms.
right,
And so we take a look and we say, what's the number of students? And we use our, what drives the number of students in a class and the teachers. And so we move them around.
okay,
And so basically, if you have an outgoing class that's large, but an incoming class that's much smaller, then we look at, like Ms. Rodriguez says, the optimal number of students in a class. You don't want classes of 10, right? And you certainly don't want classes of 30, so you try to, look at the numbers. And part of it is, we know what we know with the numbers today, but we still have kindergarten registration coming. We don't know if those are going to yield the need for more classes or less classes. That's the one crapshoot that we have in this. We have a really good idea of the number of first graders who are going to become second graders and second to third. But the incoming K is always, we're not entirely sure yet.
And that's one of the reasons we talked about having a demographic study more internally, and I think that's probably where it got a little confusing, a demographic study. And transportation was saying that transportation expenditures and students riding the bus is increasing, but that's specifically to students who are going to non-public schools. That's where the rise is, not necessarily within district.
So to your point in the presentation that we're not necessarily hiring any new FTEs, but does that also incorporate then, like what you guys call internally as far as like breakage, in the sense that we've had a couple already, I think last meeting, retirees. So is that where some of that comes into play too? I mean, you can't possibly move everybody to a different building, right?
No.
But does that factor in if I have a retiree, we're just not replacing that individual because you may be moving somebody from another building?
So, yes and no. So
Okay.
at the secondary level, we have specific teachers, right? So you need, I'm going to say, for example, if there's a high school teacher who's retiring or a middle school teacher who's a math teacher, you have to hire a math
Math
teacher
teacher,
for,
right, right.
So it's a little, we have more flexibility within the elementary buildings. But what we did do is that we had additional positions, and so we're going to look at those positions that we have sort of left over, and I don't want to say it that way, but when we look
Right.
at it, and take a look at what are the needs of the students. You've heard people say that the needs of the students have changed. So taking a look at those positions and saying, where can we take those positions and utilize them in the best way possible in our K-5 buildings or K-6 buildings, because it goes by certification. But when you talk about secondary people, we're hiring people who are 7th or 8th grade teachers or AIS teachers. Yeah, we'll replace them. Do you have a question?
I just wanted to confirm, this is kind of standard operating procedure, I would assume, right? Looking at your people coming in, determining what your resources are, and modifying and moving them as needed. This is not something new. This is something you do every year, I would
year.
assume. Okay.
And there have been positions traditionally that have been created that are ultimately really positive for our schools. If you look at, teachers who used to be classroom teachers and now are specialty area teachers at the elementary level, for example. A lot of that was because they may have gone down a section in a particular building, and we said, all right, we've got this extra person, we don't want to lose them, right? So how can we better use them, as we kind of go through the standard operating procedure of looking at the needs of the district and the numbers.
But correct, we do that every year. We take a look at what we have, we take a look at the students' needs, and then we, if we can reallocate a position to something that we feel is more important, we do that.
Are there any other questions? Thank you both very much.
Thank you.